My fellow travelers of time and effort, there comes a quiet moment when years have passed, yet nothing feels owned. No alarm sounds, no warning appears, only the weight of days spent. If this feels familiar, it is already late to ignore. There is a reason this subject unsettles you before a single idea is explained. Not because it is harsh, but because it feels familiar. You have been told, gently and repeatedly, that patience is virtue, that obedience is stability, that showing up is progress, that endurance is dignity, and so you endured. Day after day, year after year, with the quiet belief that consistency alone was building something solid beneath your feet. You trusted that time itself was an ally, that if you stayed long enough, the reward would arrive on its own. That belief is comforting, and it is precisely why it is dangerous, because comfort has a way of disguising delay as wisdom. It teaches you to confuse movement with direction. It persuades you that survival is success. Most people never consciously choose the life they end up living. They slide into it silently, reasonably, one obligation at a time. This is not an accident. It is a condition. A condition Napoleon Hill described as drifting, not as laziness, but as unquestioned obedience to circumstances. You do not drift because you are weak. You drift because resistance feels unnecessary when life appears stable. And stability is the most seductive trap of all. Look closely at the pattern most call normal life. Education to employment. Employment to routine. Routine to responsibility. Responsibility to exhaustion. Exhaustion to acceptance. At no point does anyone stop you. At no point are you threatened. At no point are you told you are failing, which is why the real loss remains invisible for decades. There is a quiet self-betrayal that happens when effort is offered without intention, when discipline is used only to maintain position, not to change direction, when energy is spent preserving comfort rather than building command. Most people believe they are sacrificing today for tomorrow. What they are actually doing is trading tomorrow for permission to remain unchallenged today. Pause here. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. If effort alone creates security, why do so many who exert effort their entire lives arrive at the same ending? There is a reason this question feels threatening, because it places responsibility where it has been carefully removed. You were never taught to distrust effort. You were taught to worship it. But effort without definiteness of purpose does not create wealth. It creates exhaustion with credentials. Andrew Carnegie did not accumulate influence by working longer hours than his laborers. Henry Ford did not command industry by repeating the same task faithfully. Their power came from decisive direction, not prolonged obedience. Yet obedience is what most are trained to perfect. Obedience to schedules, obedience to expectations, obedience to inherited definitions of success. This obedience feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels safe. And it quietly trains the mind to avoid asking the one question that changes everything. Where is this actually leading? The tragedy is not that people work hard. The tragedy is that they work hard without demanding an outcome. They invest time the way a gambler feeds coins into a machine, trusting repetition over strategy, hoping persistence will substitute for precision. There is a hidden psychological contract most people sign without reading. It says, I will give my years in exchange for reassurance, and I will ask no further questions. This contract is never written, but it is enforced through fear. Fear of criticism if you deviate. Fear of instability if you choose differently. Fear of appearing ungrateful for what you already have. And beneath all of it, the oldest fear of all, the fear of poverty. Not just lack of money, but lack of options. So you cling to what is predictable. You protect what is familiar. You call it responsibility, but responsibility without vision becomes a prison you defend. Here is the uncomfortable truth most never face until it is too late. Time does not reward loyalty. It rewards direction. Years cannot multiply what was never defined. Effort cannot compound what was never aimed. And the longer you confuse activity with progress, the more dangerous it becomes to stop. Because stopping would force you to see what has been avoided. That the real enemy was never age, never economy, never circumstance. It was the decision you never made, and the questions you postponed until later. There is a reason this realization feels heavy, because once seen, it cannot be unseen. And if this pressure is building inside you now, if something feels exposed but not yet explained, that is not discomfort. That is recognition. And recognition is where drifting begins to lose its grip, but only if you are willing to face what has been quietly controlling you all along. There comes a moment, rare, uncomfortable, when effort no longer provides reassurance, when working harder stops quieting the doubt, when the routine you once trusted begins to feel strangely hollow. This is not burnout. It is not impatience. It is not failure. It is the first sign that you are standing close to the real enemy, an enemy that does not shout, an enemy that does not resist, an enemy that survives precisely because it feels reasonable. Most people assume the obstacle is lack of opportunity, or unfair systems, or insufficient talent. Those are convenient explanations. They protect identity, because the real enemy is far more intimate. It is fear disguised as practicality, fear that presents itself as caution, fear that calls itself responsibility, fear that wears the mask of realism. Napoleon Hill understood something most never accept. Fear rarely arrives announcing itself. It arrives offering protection, protection from embarrassment, protection from instability, protection from the pain of discovering you aimed at the wrong target. So you do not stop, you do not pivot, you do not question the path. You tell yourself, at least I am moving, but movement without command is how drifting defends itself. Here is the critical distinction: most miss effort, feels virtuous. Decision feels dangerous. Effort allows you to say, I tried. Decision forces you to say, I chose. And choice carries consequences. When you decide, you expose yourself to judgment from others, and worse, from yourself. Because once a direction is chosen, excuses lose their power. So fear does something clever. It redirects your discipline away from creation and toward maintenance. You become exceptionally good at sustaining what exists, very poor at building what does not. You wake up early, you fulfill obligations, you meet expectations, and slowly, invisibly, your discipline begins serving a life you never consciously designed. This is how effort fails, not because it is insufficient, but because it is hijacked. Hijacked by the fear of disruption. Look closely at the language people use when defending their routine. I cannot afford to take risks. This is the sensible path. Now is not the right time. I have responsibilities. These statements sound mature. They are rarely examined, because examination would reveal the trade being made. Security is being purchased with potential, and fear insists this is wisdom. But fear has a predictable effect on the mind. It narrows perception. It shortens timelines. It prioritizes relief over results. Under fear's influence, you stop asking long-term questions. You focus on immediate stability. You accept incremental survival as success. And the most dangerous part, you feel productive while avoiding transformation. This is why so many hard-working people feel stuck yet exhausted. Their energy is being consumed by preservation, not progression. Thomas Edison did not fear failure because his identity was not tied to comfort. Henry Ford did not seek approval because his purpose was not negotiable. These men were not reckless. They were decisive. Fear could not negotiate with them because they had already decided. Most people never do. They remain in a permanent state of preparation, always improving skills, always gaining experience, always almost ready. Fear loves almost. Almost allows postponement without guilt. And so procrastination becomes not a behavior, but an identity. I am the type who waits for certainty. I am the type who plays it safe. I am realistic. These identities feel protective. They are quietly destructive, because certainty does not precede decision. It follows it. Faith is not belief without fear. Faith is action despite fear. Hill made this clear. Fear and faith cannot occupy the mind at the same time. One dissolves the other. But here is the tension most avoid. Faith demands a clear aim. Fear thrives in vagueness. As long as your purpose remains undefined, fear retains control. It can always argue that now is not the moment, that conditions are not ideal, that patience is safer. This is why drifting feels calm, and why decision feels violent. Decision ends debate. Fear cannot survive where direction is fixed, so it keeps you busy instead, busy enough to feel useful, busy enough to feel tired, busy enough to avoid asking why decades of effort have not translated into command. There is a reason this truth is uncomfortable, because once the enemy is seen, it can no longer pretend to be your ally. And if fear has been quietly directing your discipline, if it has been choosing safety over sovereignty, then the question becomes unavoidable. What happens the moment you stop obeying it? Do not answer yet, because there is a point still ahead, where resistance collapses and the mind is forced to confront what it has been protecting all along. That point is closer than you think. There is a moment the mind avoids at all cost, not because it is painful, but because it is final. This is the moment when explanation fails, when excuses lose their grip, when comparison no longer comforts, when the familiar stories about timing, systems, other people begin to sound hollow, even to the one telling them. This is the break point. It does not arrive dramatically. It arrives quietly, often in reflection. A late evening, an ordinary morning, a sudden awareness that years have passed, yet nothing internal has shifted. Not more money, not more respect, not more freedom. Only more responsibility layered on top of the same foundation. At this point, something collapses. Not the schedule, not the job, not the routine. The illusion collapses. The illusion that effort alone would eventually resolve direction. This is where most retreat. Because once you reach this point, one truth becomes unavoidable. No external force has been holding you where you are. No system secretly targeted you. No authority decided your ceiling. You have been participating through delay, participating through silence, participating through the decision not to decide. This realization feels dangerous because it removes the last comfortable enemy. If circumstances are not to blame, then responsibility has nowhere left to hide. Hill understood this moment deeply. He knew that transformation never begins with motivation. It begins with ownership. Ownership is not empowerment at first. It is exposure. Because ownership demands you look at what you protected, the routines you defended, the risks you avoided, the questions you postponed, and most painfully, the identity you built around being responsible, practical, patient. That identity must fracture because it has been serving fear, not purpose. At the breakpoint, you see the trade clearly. You traded decisiveness for approval. You traded discomfort for predictability. You traded authorship for safety. And the cost was time. Time does not announce its value while it is being spent. It reveals it only when options narrow. This is why the realization feels sharp. You cannot negotiate with the past. You cannot explain it away. You can only accept that drifting was not something that happened to you. It was something you allowed. This is the moment many turn back. They soften the truth. They dilute it with optimism. They say, "It is not too bad." They say others have it worse. These statements are not humility. They are retreat, because the full truth threatens the identity they have lived inside for decades. But if you remain here, if you do not look away, another truth emerges. Responsibility is heavy, but it is also liberating, because if you created the condition consciously, you can create something else consciously. This is where external blame dissolves, not because the world is fair, but because fairness was never the requirement. Direction was. Rockefeller did not wait for permission to think independently. Lincoln did not ask comfort whether the moment required courage. They were not spared fear. They refused to let fear arbitrate decisions. At the breakpoint, you see how fear negotiated every compromise. How it said, "Later," and you agreed. How it said, "Not now," and you complied. How it said, "Be grateful," and you stopped asking. And now, with decades behind you or stretching ahead, fear offers one final bargain. Accept this as your limit. It whispers, "Do not disrupt what remains." This is the most dangerous negotiation of all, because it arrives wearing realism, and it tempts you with peace. But peace without command is resignation, and resignation is drifting's final victory. Here is the pressure point you cannot avoid once seen. If nothing changes internally, nothing external can ever compensate. No raise, no recognition, no extension of time. The break point is not about regret. It is about clarity. Clarity that the old method effort without definiteness cannot be repaired. It must be replaced. And replacement requires something most people have never practiced. Mental discipline. Not positive thinking, not hope, not motivation. Control. Control over what the mind accepts as true. Control over which thoughts are allowed repetition. Control over what identity is reinforced through action. This is where resistance peaks, because control means surrendering comfort. It means allowing uncertainty. It means acting without reassurance. And the mind, trained by years of drifting, rebels. But rebellion is the sign you are near the threshold, because on the other side of this resistance is not chaos. It is structure of a higher order. A structure built not on routine, but on purpose. Do not rush past this, because what replaces fear is not automatic, and what comes next cannot coexist with the old identity. Something must be dismantled before something else can take its place. And that dismantling begins now. Once fear is exposed, it does not vanish on its own. Exposure weakens it, but absence requires replacement. This is where most fail. They tear down the old structure and expect freedom to organize itself. It does not. The mind does not tolerate vacuum. If fear is removed without installing command, drift returns more subtly than before. So understand this clearly. Faith is not an emotion. It is a discipline. It is the deliberate training of the mind to accept a chosen direction as final before evidence appears. This is the part that sounds abstract until it is understood correctly. Faith is not hoping outcomes will work out. Faith is deciding that hesitation is no longer permitted. Hill's principle of autosuggestion was never about repeating pleasant phrases. It was about reprogramming authority inside the mind. For years, your mind has taken orders from circumstances, from schedules, from obligations, from other people's expectations. Faith reverses that hierarchy. It says the mind will now take instruction from purpose. This is not inspirational. It is confrontational, because the first thing faith demands is definiteness, not a vague desire, not a flexible preference, a fixed aim. Until purpose is exact, fear retains leverage. Fear thrives on options. Faith requires commitment. This is why most people resist defining their aim precisely. Precision removes escape routes. Once you define what you are building, what you are becoming, what you will no longer tolerate, every action is judged against that standard, and judgment is uncomfortable. But here is the transformation most never experience. When purpose becomes definite, discipline changes character. It no longer feels like self-denial. It feels like alignment. You stop forcing yourself to act. You stop negotiating with resistance, because resistance has no authority where direction is settled. This is why faith must replace fear, not emotion for emotion, but command for reaction. Fear reacts. Faith directs. The disciplined mind does not wait for confidence. Confidence is a byproduct of kept promises to self. Each small act aligned with purpose reinforces identity. Each avoided compromise weakens the old pattern. This is slow at first, quiet, unimpressive to others, and that is precisely why it works. Power does not announce itself while forming. Consider the mastermind principle, not as networking but as environment control. Your mind is shaped by the dominant ideas it is exposed to repeatedly. If those ideas come from fearful, drifting minds, your discipline will always collapse under pressure. Faith requires insulation, not isolation from people, but separation from influence. This may cost you familiarity. It may cost you approval. And here the final fear surfaces. The fear of criticism. Criticism is not dangerous because it is accurate. It is dangerous because it pressures you to abandon internal authority. So faith must be quiet, unargued, undemonstrated. You do not convince others. You convince yourself through action. This is why transformation often looks like withdrawal at first. You speak less. You explain less. You act more. And slowly something unfamiliar happens. Time begins to behave differently. Days no longer blur together. Effort compounds instead of dissipating. Decisions simplify, not because life becomes easier, but because confusion loses its grip. The disciplined mind does not eliminate fear. It renders fear irrelevant. Fear still appears, but it no longer votes. And here is the tension that remains unresolved. Faith demands consistency, not intensity, and consistency exposes you daily to uncertainty. There is no applause for this phase, no reassurance, no guarantees. Only the quiet knowledge that you are no longer negotiating with the very force that kept you small, but something else is forming now, an identity not built on endurance, but on authorship, an authority that does not need permission. This is not the end. It is not even the visible beginning. It is the internal shift that makes the final transformation inevitable. And once this shift stabilizes, life responds differently, not dramatically, not immediately, but permanently. And that permanence carries a power that does not seek attention and does not fear time. There is a kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not hurry. It does not seek confirmation. It moves without noise because it is no longer proving anything. This is the state few ever reach, not because it is unattainable, but because it requires something rare, final internal settlement. By the time this power forms, the old questions no longer appear. Am I doing enough? Am I behind? What will others think? These questions vanish not through reassurance, but through irrelevance. They belong to an identity that no longer governs you. You have crossed from reaction to command. This does not mean life becomes gentle. It means life becomes clear. Clarity is the reward of definiteness. Once purpose is fixed and faith is disciplined, time stops feeling like a threat. Not because there is more of it, but because none of it is being wasted unconsciously. You no longer measure days by effort. You measure them by alignment. This is the quiet power Hill understood but rarely emphasized publicly, because it cannot be taught to those still negotiating with fear. Quiet power comes from non-drifting, from knowing precisely what you are building and what you are not, from refusing to borrow identities offered by society, from declining to explain yourself to those who have not decided for themselves. This power does not need dramatic risk. It is systematic. It compounds through small, deliberate acts repeated without emotional debate. This is why those who reach it often appear ordinary from the outside. They do not perform urgency. They do not display anxiety. They do not chase validation. They move steadily, because they are no longer rushing away from fear. They are moving towards something fixed. And here is the final truth that reshapes identity permanently. Most people spend their lives trying to secure the future. Quiet power focuses on commanding the present. When you command the present, your thoughts, your standards, your decisions, the future stops being a gamble. This is why age loses its intimidation. 60 is not the issue. Time was never the enemy. Drifting was. The moment drifting ends, time becomes a tool. You may not reclaim every year behind you, but you reclaim authority over every year ahead. And authority changes how outcomes accumulate. Not through luck, not through rescue, but through inevitability. Because when direction is set and discipline obeys purpose, results stop being optional. They may be delayed. They may arrive quietly, but they arrive. This is why some people grow calmer as years pass, while others grow desperate. One group obeyed circumstance, the other obeyed decision. This difference is not visible early. It becomes unmistakable later. And now you understand why working without definiteness leads nowhere. Why effort without command exhausts itself. Why fear masquerading as realism quietly steals decades. But more importantly, you understand something deeper. You were never meant to merely endure time. You were meant to direct it. This understanding does not require excitement. It requires resolve. And resolve does not shout. It settles. When this settles in you, you will notice something subtle. The world will still make demands, but it will no longer decide who you are. That decision has already been made. And once made, it does not ask permission from age, opinion, or circumstance. That is quiet power, and it is the only kind that lasts.